Hello, and welcome to Explorations in Economic History and Thoughts. And today we are going to talk about the new economic policy and the end of war communism and how the new economic policy was a retreat to markets. We spoke in the last video about the failure of war communism. However, it's important to ask how the leaders knew that it was the policies of war communism that were the problem, and that the so-called retreat to markets would succeed and would lead to an improved economy. So some people say about the war communism period that the major problem was that they were trying to fight a war. They had just fought World War I, and the economy was already in shambles, and then they had to fight the Civil War. However, the Civil War ended before the end of war communism. And for a while, the leadership continued to nationalize factories and to essentially to continue on the road to building communism. But then at some point, Lenin decided not to continue and decided to do this so-called retreat back to markets. So why did Lenin do this? What made him so sure that this would work? And of course it did work. So there's a book called Trotskyism, Counter-Revolution in Disguise. It's written by a Marxist and a pro-Soviet writer. And he writes that war communism, which had prevailed from 1918, was a means to fight the Civil War and repel intervention. So, according to this idea, war communism was necessary in order to fight the Civil War. So you'd think that it was successful, that it was a powerful tool. However, he goes on, the government laid its hands on everything produced in the country and distributed everything according to a plan in order to be able to withstand the attack of the class enemy forces. Again, it sounds as if it was that they were expecting it to work. He continues, during those years, production did not increase, it decreased. Transportation was not improved, it deteriorated. The major portion of what was produced in the factories and plants went for the front. Of course, the Civil War ended, like I said, before the end of war communism. The government collected foodstuffs and raw materials from the peasants and was supposed to give in return manufactured goods. These, however, were not forthcoming due to the collapse of the industrial system and the necessity to supply the front. But again, there was no necessity to supply the front by the end of the war communism period, but still Lenin decided it was necessary to, quote-unquote, retreat back to a market system. And Trotskyism, Counter-Revolution in Disguise continues. He says, as a result, the peasants were actually supporting the country in those crucial years, and the government, to use Lenin's expression, gave them promissory notes. It promised them a better fate in the future. When the war was finished, at least in its major aspects, when the republic seemed to be secure, at least for a while, it became obvious that the continuation of military communism was an impossibility. He continues, it was necessary to strengthen the alliance with the middle peasants, which had become strained under the pressure of military communism. It was necessary to lay the foundations of socialist construction. So lay the foundations. So why was it necessary to introduce markets in order to lay the foundations of socialist construction? Well, he goes on, in the first place, the country under the Soviets had to learn how to produce. The peasants had to be given the incentive to increase their crops, and this could be achieved only when they were allowed to sell their goods in the open market. So he's saying it's an incentives issue. He goes on, this necessitated the legalization of the open market. In order to get out of the horrible economic stagnation, it was necessary to encourage even private industrial production. And of course, we'll talk about how much of that was allowed under the new economic policy. But so this is a pro-Soviet Marxist writer saying that it was necessary to reintroduce selling in the open markets for the peasants in order to encourage them to actually produce. What were some of the features of the new economic policy? Well, it wasn't a free market economy. It wasn't laissez-faire. There's some features here listed that show you how the Bolsheviks did try to keep as much power as possible in the hands of the state while still allowing some private ownership and market exchange. So, for example, the credit system was still in the hands of the state. Foreign trade was still in the hands of the state. and city lands and buildings, agricultural lands were, much agricultural land was in the hands of regional and local Soviets, although peasants were allowed to sell the surplus of their produce in the open market after paying taxes. So in short, there was limited legalization of private trade, but the state still began to rationally plan distribution through state stores that at this time competed with the private sellers. And many people in the party argued that private trade, that socialist industry was a stimulus to private trade, theoretically. But they also, at this time, it conceded that private trade could be a stimulus to socialist industry, which was already lagging and showing a lot of problems. During War Communism, there were many kinds of problems, including just, shortages, major shortages. But at the beginning of the new economic policy, they also realized that the socialist trade was often, of poor quality, poor customer service, and so forth, which we'll talk more about in a moment. So what NEP was not is a truly free market economy, and it was also not a coordinated market socialist economy designed and producing, results as expected. It wasn't some kind of designed perfect new system, a mixed system or a market socialist system that was producing, exactly what the leaders wanted. It was neither of those. What it really was breathing space, as Lenin frequently called it. And there are descriptions written at the time that convey how much what a relief it was, and how shocked and pleased everyone was when they started to see actual food in markets. So there's this wonderful quote from Michael Bulgakov, where he speaks of waves of fabric, lace, rows of boxes of face powder. There's a confectioner's shop at every step, and all day until closing, they're full of people. The shelves are full of white bread, wheatmeal loaves, French rolls, countless rows, and so on and so on. He's thrilled, just amazed to be able to see food again in the markets, to not have these chronic problems of shortage. And another thing that NEP brought is competition. And so there was competition between the private retailers, but there was also competition between the state sector and the private sector. There's a quote from a paper called Retelling the Revolution about this period. It says, "Within the NEP retail economy, the state sought a place for itself, becoming a competitor that tried to gradually eliminate private manufacturers and retailers, even as it tolerated them as a temporary necessary means." So again, the leadership not only wanted the state to continue to own and control certain parts of the economy, but it was also, NEP was part of its plan to ultimately lead to socialism. They still wanted to build socialism. And so the NEP was a temporary measure. It offered breathing space and so forth. And it also was a way that the state could allow private trade within only the confines that it wanted, and begin to eliminate capitalists if they got too wealthy, and to begin to try to edge out the private trade so that over time the state sector would take over everywhere. So during these years of NEP, there were new laws introduced limiting sometimes targeting specific capitalists and specific businesses, and sometimes just introducing more and more restrictions little by little where it thought it could get away with it. And within this framework, the private trade and the public trade were competitors, and the people and the state would take sides between them. There was a lot of propaganda to say, buy at state stores only, pushing people to try to give the state stores an advantage legally and through propaganda and in other ways, in order to try to slowly work towards a socialist economy.